Prime Minister, thank you so much for agreeing to this France 24 interview in what surely are very difficult times for the region you live in. For those of our viewers who are not familiar with the region you live in, I'd like to bring up a map. I'll describe it for you, Mr. Prime Minister. You may not be in agreement with this map, although it is widely circulated in the international arena. It shows your country, Armenia, on the left, Azerbaijan, your neighboring country, on the right, and in what is looking like Azerbaijani territory, the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh, which actually declared its independence back in the 90s, which not a single member of the United Nations recognized, not even your country, Armenia. Now, very recently, you took what looks like a very hardline approach on this issue. You went to Nagorno-Karabakh and declared that the Republic of Artsakh, which is another name for the Nagorno-Karabakh region, is Armenia. Here again, Mr. Prime Minister, not a single member of the United Nations is in agreement with that statement. Why do you persist?
Unfortunately, I'm not seeing the map which you put on display, so I cannot comment. The map. As to the statement which you referred to, it's very important to know the history of the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, because in your statement you said contested territory. Unfortunately, at some point in time, the international media started to present the Nagorno-Karabakh issue as a territorial dispute, and the reason for that is that the history and the origin of the Nagorno-Karabakh issue has been forgotten. Back in 1988, in the Soviet era, where there was a process of perestroika and democratization, the people of Karabakh, in this period of Gorbachev's reforms, determined to restore their rights which had been violated in the period of formation of the Soviet Union, when, as a result of Stalin's arbitrary decision, Nagorno-Karabakh, with over 80% Armenian population, had been annexed to Soviet Azerbaijan and was not incorporated into Soviet Armenia. And so in 1988, the Parliament of the Autonomous District of Nagorno-Karabakh adopted a decision on unification with Armenia. This was an absolutely peaceful process. In fact, I wish to highlight that back then the movement was perceived as a process of democratization of the Soviet Union. Many people in Europe were saying that as a result of the process that began with the Karabakh movement, the Berlin Wall came down. In response to this peaceful decision in Karabakh, Soviet Union and Soviet Azerbaijan exerted violence, carrying out killings of Armenians in the towns of Sumgait and Baku, and that's how the conflict came about. As to the period of the collapsing of the Soviet Union, when Soviet Azerbaijan declared independence from the Soviet Union, the Autonomous District of Nagorno-Karabakh exercised its rights under the Soviet legislation, which provided that if a Soviet republic gains independence, an autonomous unit within a Soviet republic has the right to determine its status. So did Nagorno-Karabakh, and it determined to declare its independence. As to your statement that nobody has so far recognized the independence of Karabakh, that is why the struggle goes on. That is why the struggle goes on of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh and the people of Armenia, so that the people of Nagorno-Karabakh can exercise and have opportunities for exercising their right to self-determination. Now, as to why Artsakh and Nagorno-Karabakh is Armenia, if you go to Karabakh today, you will find 4th century, 5th century, 7th century, 10th, 13th century Armenian churches. The very first Armenian school ever was created in the territory of Nagorno-Karabakh. Nagorno-Karabakh with over 80% of the population have always been Armenian, and Armenia means land of Armenians, Hayastan, land of the high people, and throughout its history, Nagorno-Karabakh was land of the Armenians. And I want to also emphasize that this is not a territorial dispute. This is about a problem of exercising human rights, people's rights.
So,
as I said, the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh are facing an existential threat.
Mr. Prime Minister, if I may, you mentioned the right of the people in Nagorno-Karabakh to exercise their international...
I can finish the sentence. If I can finish the sentence.
Please go ahead. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you. If I just may, you brought up the right of the people of Nagorno-Karabakh to exercise their independence. You mentioned international rights. There usually is a commonly agreed upon framework for this, namely international law as decided within the United Nations. That arena generally sets the framework for these kinds of conversations. There have been several resolutions voted and adopted by the United Nations General Assembly which refer to Nagorno-Karabakh, and you know these resolutions very well, Mr. Prime Minister, as occupied territories, which talk about occupation. You realize that, correct?
Ով է օկուպացրել այդ տարածքները?
Well, for instance, Resolution 62-243 mentions the situation in the occupied territories of Azerbaijan. Obviously, Azerbaijan is not occupying its own territory if it is agreed upon that that is a part of Azerbaijan.
Ով է օկուպացրել այդ? Ուրեմն ես ինչ եմ.
But the question is, who occupy? Let me just continue my sentence. If you read these resolutions carefully, essentially the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh were facing an existential threat. Before the movement began, it was a creeping threat in the sense that Azerbaijan's policy was aimed against the Armenian identity. And before the movement began, that existential threat became an imminent threat because against the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh, force was being used. And in that period of declaring independence, a complete whole-scale war began against Nagorno-Karabakh. Towns and villages were being shelled, bombed, and people were unable, for about 2 years, people were unable to live in their homes. And considering that no international force was stopping this process, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh formed self-defense units, and as a result of the activities of the self-defense forces, the attacks, including the rocket attacks, had to be pushed away from their homes. If you read carefully the UN Security Council resolutions, you will see that they clearly read that Azerbaijan violated the ceasefire agreement, and that as a result of that lost territories, and those territories were lost to the Nagorno-Karabakh self-defense forces as a result of the activities of the local Armenian forces. And today Azerbaijan does not respect the ceasefire again, and that may again lead to grave consequences, really for the whole region, including for Azerbaijan.
If I may, Mr. Prime Minister, we have very little time left. I'd like to ask you a question about the kind of language you have been using. We know that Turkey has been backing very forcefully, militarily, vocally, Azerbaijan. You have compared Erdogan to Hitler, saying that Turkey is engaging in a genocidal plot in the region. But you have received, you just mentioned so yourself, very little backing from potential international allies, namely Russia, perhaps your closest allies. Is that because, in your mind, the world does not understand or does not care?
First of all, let us acknowledge that a number of countries, including the OSCE Minsk Group co-chair countries, have already accepted and acknowledged that Turkey is involved in the hostilities, and it is Turkey who incited this military campaign. Secondly, many representatives of the international community, countries, Russia, Iran, France, other countries, have accepted, acknowledged that Turkey it has been transporting mercenaries and terrorists from Syria to Azerbaijan to unleash the attack on Nagorno-Karabakh. And I say clearly that, yes, Turkey has returned to the South Caucasus 100 years later to continue the genocidal policy against the Armenians. But it pursues a very concrete, pragmatic purpose. It's because the Armenians in the South Caucasus are the last obstacle to his expansionist policy to the north, to the east, to the south, east to be continued. And all of this must be seen in light of the policy which Turkey is carrying out in the Mediterranean, in Syria, in Iraq, in the relationship with Greece, with Cyprus, and the world must confront this fact.
Mr. Prime Minister, we have very little time left.
If this fact
I may just ask
is
one
not
last question.
properly assessed, then Europe should wait for Turkey near Vienna.
If I may, Mr. Prime Minister, I'd just like to ask one last question. We have very little time left. The president of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, recently pressed by France 24's Catherine Norris-Trent on the issue of civilian casualties, accused your country, Armenia, of intentionally installing military equipment within areas populated by civilians, therefore incurring civilian casualties. What's your response, please, Mr. Prime Minister?
Well, you see, recently a video was published showing the bombing of Stepanakert, the capital of Nagorno-Karabakh. The international media made those videos, and I paid attention to the fact that in those videos, in the places where bombs were falling, there was no military infrastructure. Moreover, there was not a single member of the military in those places. It is being done as part of a genocidal policy. Aliyev, as in the past, and Azerbaijan pursue the aim of committing genocide against the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh by killing, displacing, and with the purpose of carrying out ethnic cleansing. And the international media can testify to this. In Stepanakert, what is happening is this. People's homes are being simply destroyed, so they have no possibility of going back to their homes, no place to live. This is why we say that the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh are facing an existential threat.
Mr. Prime Minister,
there's only one solution to this problem. The international community must recognize the right of self-determination of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is cessation for salvation, which, because the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh cannot exist under Azerbaijani control. That is simply impossible, and the international community must recognize the independence of Nagorno-Karabakh, and there must be, and I'm glad that, although on the level of city councils in Europe, this process has begun. We hope it will spread like a wave.
Mr. Prime Minister, I have just one last question for you. You are incredibly popular back in your country, and to a certain extent in the international arena as well, which viewed very favorably the advent of your government when you came to power very recently, back in 2018, in a peaceful process known as the Velvet Revolution. Why not use this popularity in order to engage in meaningful negotiations, which, as you well know, will require some compromises, such as territorial concessions, which surely are a better option than the death and destruction that we are seeing today and that we have seen in this decades-long conflict in which your country, Armenia, and its neighbor, Azerbaijan, have been locked in?
And I tried to do that, and I proposed compromise. But in these negotiation processes, it is becoming obvious that Azerbaijan and now also Turkey do not in any way want to give up on their genocidal policy. And I reiterate, this problem has no solution other than remedial cessation. That must be the formula to be applied, remedial cessation, because now Azerbaijan, also with Turkey and the support of terrorists, is pursuing one aim, which is to...
Would you mind being specific about the types of concessions that you're willing to make?
Yes, I can be more specific.
Ես առաջարկեցի նախ հետեւյալ բանաձևը, գիտեք ինչ, անընդհատ
I propose the following formula.
Նախ մենք պետք է հայեցակարգ ունենանք հարցը ինչպես
Are you
We
willing
have
to
to
give a
have a
plan?
concept for solution of the problem.
եթե որևէ մեկը
If anyone
կարծում է որ
If anyone thinks that the Armenian side should make unilateral concessions, then they would be referring to capitulation of the Armenian side. This is not resolution of the issue. I suggested that we first agree on the concept, on the framework, to understand the formula for solution, and I said that any solution of the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh must be acceptable to the people of Armenia, the people of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the people of Azerbaijan. And I have been the first leader in taking part in the negotiations who says that any solution must be acceptable to the other side as well. But Azerbaijan has continued has remained persistent in saying
Mr.
that
Prime
the
Minister.
solution must be only one that is acceptable only to Azerbaijan and the people of Azerbaijan, which basically means that Nagorno-Karabakh must be cleansed, in their view, through ethnically cleansed of Armenians.
Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Unfortunately, there are many more questions, but that's all we have time for. Don't go anywhere if you're watching this. Stay tuned. There's more news coming up on France 24.